Welcome back to the leading edge of integrative mental health. I'm your host, Lisa Dale Miller. You can subscribe and stream The Groundless Ground on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Pandora, Stitcher, Google Podcast, Amazon Music, TuneIn, and YouTube. And of course, find out more at groundlessground.com. Eric Garland returns to The Groundless Ground to discuss exciting new research on the effectiveness of MORE, mindfulness-oriented recovery enhancement, his unique mindfulness intervention for alleviating the cognitive affective distress associated with chronic pain and co-occurring opioid misuse. We also focus on the value of meditation, expanding consciousness, and experiencing bliss in decreasing patients' reliance on opioids and increasing their capacity for ordinary pleasure. Of course, there's lots of neuroscience, and we even discuss research on the role of psychedelics as adjunctive treatment for chronic pain and opioid misuse. It's always a joy to dialogue with Eric, and I know you'll all get so much out of this episode. Eric Garland, it's been maybe 2 years.
Has it been that long? It's amazing.
I think we recorded about a month into COVID. Incredibly, your lab has done so much, even under these terribly strange conditions.
It's true. We have. We've been able to keep things going.
I don't know how you did that.
We had to really pivot, think fast on our feet, so to speak. One of the main things was switching our delivery of mindfulness-oriented recovery enhancement to online delivery over Zoom. That made a huge difference to innovate in that way. And so we figured out how to basically take the studies that we were doing in person and translate them into the remote environment that enabled us to keep the wheel turning.
So today we're going to talk about some of the research that you were hinting at 2 years ago.
I'm sitting on a treasure trove right now.
I have 4 studies that really just stood out for me. I'm sure you have others, not just others that have been published, but maybe some in the queue, so to speak. But before we do that, may I just ask you, just because I'm curious, and since we saw each other, there was at least one episode that I did on delivering somatic interventions remotely and how that's different and what has been noticed and how the interventions change. And so I'm curious if you have any insights or reflections on how MORE, mindfulness-oriented recovery, might have been different for people.
My first learning from this effort to really transpose MORE for the online environment is that it does seem to work. I'm not sure that it works as well. I'm actually dubious that it does work as well. And I think the problem with it is probably the same thing that would be with a somatic therapist, which is teaching meditation, probably like doing somatic therapy, is all about reading the body language of your patient. And that is something that is difficult to do when you're using a not so great resolution camera over Zoom. And even worse is the time lag that occurs. So when we teach meditation and MORE, the highest level of practice is to synchronize the verbal instructions, the verbal suggestions to the breathing rate of the participants, to create a nonverbal synchrony to allow the mind to become more open to suggestion. And, there's plenty of research in physics and in biology that when you have 2 oscillating systems and you bring them together, they start, even if they're oscillating at a different rate, when they come together, they begin to oscillate at the same rate. And as they synchronize like this, it facilitates the transfer of energy between the systems. In MORE, we're conscious of this possibility. And so we try to really capitalize on that in the teaching of meditation as a way to help people to achieve deeper states of consciousness. I think that gets messed up online because if you've ever tried to play music over Zoom, so for example, I'm a drummer. If I try to play music with a guitar player and we try to play over Zoom, it doesn't work because the timing is off, and timing is everything. So that's my long-winded explanation. Issues around timing in relation to nonverbal synchrony between the therapist and the client, it's not optimal over Zoom. That being said, we actually just finished a study of telehealth MORE, and it seems like it's working pretty well. It's certainly better than nothing. There are some benefits to it, which is it's more accessible. People don't have to leave their home to get therapy. And when you're working with people with chronic pain, that's a big deal because for them, getting out of bed, getting dressed, driving a place is difficult. It's painful. Similarly, people with addiction, they oftentimes have pretty rough lives. There's a lot of chaos in their lives, and it may be hard to attend a treatment session in person. But if you can just whip out your phone and do it through Zoom, even though there may be a decrement in efficacy, we don't know that yet. But if there is one, plus side is there's increased access to treatment, which is a big one.
I guess you'll have to do the double-blind study. If I didn't know about mindfulness-oriented recovery enhancement, which I do, I would think that these studies are delivering it one therapist to one patient. But I know it's a group intervention, correct?
Right.
So the thing is, wow, this is so long ago. I'm so old. I taught on eMindful, I think it was called. This was 15 years ago. I actually taught mindfulness-based relapse prevention groups on eMindful. And back then, let me tell you, the technology was hideous. And you really couldn't see anyone. They could only see you. They could hear each other, but they couldn't see each other. I remember maybe the first two groups I did, I didn't feel like there was the group cohesion. But when I got better at actually simulating the kind of group cohesion that I had in my MBRP groups and MBSR groups, I started to get results from the participants that were the same. They got results. They felt more connected because of the way I was doing the group in an online environment. So I'm imagining you use some interventions to help the group cohesion happen online, because I think that's probably an important piece in person, even for more.
Probably is. All my studies have used group supportive therapy as the control condition, where there certainly is a bunch of group cohesion. More beats the pants off of that. And that leads to the JAMA paper. So we could bridge to that if you want.
This is very exciting. A study in JAMA is rare for any mindfulness intervention. So hats off to you.
Thank you. It's my life's work is crystallized into this single paper. So it's the most important thing I've ever done. And you're right about mindfulness in JAMA is rare. In JAMA Internal Medicine, I think this paper was only maybe the second or third paper on mindfulness ever published in the history of that journal. This was the culmination of many years of work. This was a 5-year NIH-funded randomized controlled trial, but it actually took me many years to get the grant. So in total, this paper is a crystallization of 9 years of work, beginning with the conception of the idea. You don't see the 9 years when you read the paper. This was a full-scale clinical trial to definitively establish the efficacy of more. Does more work? It does. It works quite well. We had done some pilot randomized controlled trials prior to that study, and they were fairly substantial, about 100 people in each one of those studies. But this was the big one. So this study had 250 patients in the study, and we followed them for a long time. We followed them for 9 months after the end of the 8-week therapy. In the paper, we call it a 9-month follow-up. If you count from the time the people started the study, it really was a year. The other interesting feature about the study was we were testing more in primary care. So we actually were delivering the more therapy in doctors' offices in the community, in the same doctors' offices where the patients were receiving their opioid pain management. So all these patients were people with chronic pain. They were all prescribed opioids to alleviate pain. And they were all misusing opioids or at risk for misusing opioids as they entered into the trial. That was the criterion. And we compared 8 weeks of more to 8 weeks of standard supportive group therapy, really a Rogerian kind of client-centered therapeutic approach, bring people together, they talk about their emotions, the therapist expresses empathy, people give each other support. I see you slapping your head here. It's a great control condition. It's quote unquote therapy, right? People like it and people find it meaningful. They feel heard and they feel connected with, and there's plenty of powerful group cohesion and dynamic. So that brings back your last comment. More beat the pants off of it. In summary of the findings, more reduced opioid misuse by 45% by the 9-month follow-up point. That's more than double the effect of standard supportive psychotherapy. Supportive psychotherapy was pretty good. I mean, it reduced opioid misuse by a little more than 20%, but more than doubled that effect. And that, to my knowledge, is one of the largest effect sizes of any treatment for any addiction, period. So that should be grabbing our attention. And we used a pretty rigorous way of measuring opioid misuse. It was a combination of self-report. We did blinded clinical interviews. So people interviewed the patients and they didn't know whether they had gotten more or standard therapy, and they asked them about their opioid misuse. And then we also gave them a drug urine screen. So it was a pretty objective way, the best way we could possibly capture opioid misuse. We also found that more reduced opioid use as well. It was a significant decrease in opioid dosing, and 36% of the patients treated with more were able to cut their opioid dose in half or greater by the 9-month follow-up point. And what was really amazing about that was that we didn't push people to cut their opioids. We didn't tell them to reduce their opioids. We didn't ask them. The doctors didn't taper them. They just did it on their own. We gave them the skills of how to regulate their pain and regulate craving and regulate their automatic habits and how to savor the goodness in life and how to enhance positive emotions and re-experience natural pleasure. Teaching people that, they just decided to reduce their opioid use on their own. So that was really pretty amazing. So we also found that more reduced pain symptoms and reduced emotional distress. 50% of patients treated with more achieved a clinically significant reduction in pain. It wasn't a huge reduction, but it was enough to matter. And the effects of more were larger than those observed for the current gold standard psychological treatment for chronic pain, CBT. And so that was pretty cool. And the effects of more on pain-related function, on how much pain was impairing people's lives, those effects were actually really huge. And the effects lasted, again, 9 months after the end of treatment.
And just one clarification here, which really speaks to the intervention. After the 8 weeks, they did not have any interventional contact with any of you. There were no follow-up groups. There was nothing. They were left on their own with a set of skills. And this is huge. This kind of effect size at 9 months with no supportive follow-up, skills group or anything. This is what blew me away.
It blew me away too. And what's amazing about it, if you look at the graphs in the paper, you see the effect is getting larger over time. Most psychotherapies, the treatment is most powerful at the end of the treatment, and then it starts to tail off. But here, the effects actually grew stronger over time. We don't really know why that is. I have some guesses, but we don't really know why.
When you did the interviews to get the stats, I'm assuming you did 3 months, 6 months, 9 months. Is that how you did it?
That's right.
Did you have a sheet where they listed the amount of practice they were doing per day, minutes, which of the practices they were doing, and how many times a week they were doing it?
Unfortunately, we did not quantify practice very well in the follow-up period. What we did do in the study, and this hasn't been published yet, we used smartphones and we had people tell us how many minutes they practiced each day, every day for the 8-week therapy, as well as for the month afterwards. So we got some really intensive data on mindfulness practice in everyday life. But then we stopped at the end of the month because basically the grant reviewers thought it'd be too burdensome on the patients to keep asking them about their practice. But I really wish I did, because I think that it probably explains some of it. I haven't published these data yet, but definitely practice predicts outcomes. And the differential types of practices have differential effects on the outcomes. That's part of the treasure trove I was alluding to. We're going to be unpacking that now for quite a while, because it gets pretty complicated. We did what's called EMA, Ecological Momentary Assessment. So we pinged people with their smartphones 3 times a day, every day for 3 months. It gives you this tremendous amount of data, 270 data points per person. So we can really see how people's craving was changing from moment to moment, how their mood was changing from moment to moment, how their pain was changing moment to moment, how their mindfulness was changing moment to moment, and then look at how the mindfulness reappraisal and savoring techniques, the differential effects that those practices have. So pretty excited about that. And then one last detail about the study, which is at the beginning of the study, about 68% of patients met criteria for major depressive disorder. So by and large, they were depressed, in addition to having chronic pain and misusing opioids. But by the end of the 9 months at the end of the study, patients and more were reporting depression symptom levels that were beneath the cutoff for depression. So on average, they weren't depressed anymore. So that's pretty amazing too. So this therapy not only alleviated physical pain, but it also seems to alleviate emotional pain. We've used this EMA approach in a lot of our studies, getting very frequent assessments of craving and mood and whatnot. One of the findings that keeps showing up in the data set over and over again is that if I feel happy in this moment, my craving for drugs is less in the next moment. And that more increases happiness from moment to moment. It also decreases negative emotion, but those two things are not the same. The absence of negative emotion does not imply the presence of positive emotion. And of the two, presence of positive emotion is a much more powerful predictor of decreased addictive behavior. And so more is actually enhancing positive emotion in everyday life. And the more that it enhances positive emotion, the greater the relief from craving. And this ties back to what we talked about in our last interview, my restructuring reward hypothesis, which states that if you can shift somebody from valuing drugs back to valuing the natural healthy rewards in their life, that will reduce their craving and their addictive behavior. I've shown that time and time again across multiple studies and data sets. And so that's another one of the findings that we have from this JAMA paper that didn't make it into the paper, but it's going to be in its own paper, the effects of more on reward restructuring, the largest and strongest, most compelling demonstration of this yet.
Just in line with that, do you think that the increase in what you're calling happiness, I don't know if it means contentment.
Positive emotion, very broadly construed.
So I don't know if that actually has correlation with shifting the dopamine reward network back to its normal level of functioning, of savoring.
Remember, we've shown this not only with self-reported positive emotion, but we've shown that more increases the sensitivity of the brain and the body to natural healthy rewards. So we show people images of smiling babies, lovers holding hands, beautiful sunsets, beautiful mountains. And after 8 weeks of more, the patient's brains are more reactive. They're more responsive to viewing those cues. And that increased reactivity to the naturally rewarding cue is well known in basic neuroscience to be mediated by dopamine release in the brain.
And you think this is because of the practice, not necessarily because there's less opioids in their system?
That's a good question. The reason why I say that is we've done statistical modeling to look at changes in the brain's reward responsivity and in positive emotional reactivity as a predictor of future opioid misuse. And it does. So the effect of more on reducing opioid misuse in the future is mediated by changes in this restructuring of reward processes in the brain. Decreasing drug use, there's going to be some recovery of the dopamine function to natural reward. So I do think that's going to happen. But I also think that training people through mindfulness and savoring to increase their responsivity to natural healthy pleasure will also change dopamine function and endogenous opioid function, and thereby reduce the need for the drug. Because in effect, what we're doing is we're teaching people how to get high on life more deeply. And I know that you and I both share this appreciation for the word I'll use is the mystical, but on an even deeper level is teaching people how to access the endless wellspring of bliss that is the nature of consciousness itself.
Indeed. My patients are surprised. I'm not sure if the people in the more interventions are surprised that awareness itself has that quality of open-heartedness and joy.
I don't know if they're surprised. They just feel good. And it certainly is a huge relief to realize, and we try to help them realize this, the therapy, that they have the power to access this. This is their own inherent ability to access this bliss, this peace. And that's just such a powerful learning experience, especially for somebody with a problem with addiction, to realize that the message that we give them is very concrete, very simple, which is you can make yourself feel good naturally. You can make yourself feel good by savoring the beauty in life, but you can even make yourself feel good in a totally blank, dark room with nothing there at all.
Oh, and by the way, there's no tolerance and dependence.
Right.
It doesn't get worse.
In fact, it's the opposite. Rather than tolerance, there is sensitization. The more times that you enter the state, the easier it will become and the more deeply you will go.
Which is so interesting, isn't it? I think this is a lesson that the human system is so sophisticated and so profound. When you mess with it by putting something in it externally in an amount that the organism doesn't really like and isn't really the way the organism would deliver it, if you were just harnessing the aspects and qualities of the way the human mind can direct itself. I think this is what people don't get. People just naturally assume that they don't have the capacity innately and they must get something external and put it in them.
Totally. And it's such a subtle thing that most people don't realize. I certainly didn't realize this for a lot of my life. Bliss is everywhere. So I'll give you a simple example. So the feeling of your butt against the chair.
Right.
Like, that's just the feeling of my butt against the chair. No, actually, really focus on the feeling of your butt against the chair. And imagine, what's the difference between that and if you were sitting on a bed of nails, for example? There's a big difference, right? It doesn't hurt. In fact, my body's resting, and my body's resting comfortably. There's a cushion on this chair. So even something as simple as the feeling of my butt against the chair is good, contains bliss. Breathing is another one. We certainly take that for granted, right? How many times a day do you breathe? But what is breathing? Breathing is life. Every time you breathe, that's bringing life into your body. In most cases, that's better than death. You're focusing on the basic sense of existence. That is rewarding.
Yeah.
Or, Nico Frijda, who's this affective scientist, said that even something like standing upright is rewarding. And you think, well, what? That doesn't make any sense. But he says, yeah, think about it. Like, you're not collapsed on the floor in a pile. You're actually using your muscles to accomplish a goal. The goal is to hold the body upright, and you're successfully doing it. And so there's a dopamine release because the motor system is accomplishing the motivated behavior. It's rewarding. So anything could be rewarding if you really give it enough attention.
Well, we've just gone into the second study, which is Moore's capacity to improve negative emotion regulation among opioid-treated chronic pain patients by increasing interoceptive awareness, which is examples we just talked about. So do you want to say a little bit about interoception and how this practices in Moore cultivate this and the effect of that?
The main thrust of this paper is, and this was a paper led by my postdoc, Lene Roberts. This was a test of the mindfulness to meaning theory. And the mindfulness to meaning theory is a theory that I developed to explain how ostensibly non-cognitive, non-judgmental state of mindfulness, and I say ostensibly because I have some bones to pick about that too, but ostensibly non-judgmental, non-cognitive state of mindfulness could lead to the enhanced capacity to reframe adversity as a source of psychological growth. My hypothesis is that mindfulness, one of the ways that mindfulness builds resilience in the face of stress and adversity, is it helps us to reframe our negative thought patterns about our lives. And I got a lot of flack for that theory by my good friends and colleagues over the many years, tons of criticism for that theory. And the criticism was basically, you're saying that mindfulness helps people change the way they think, but mindfulness is all about accepting.
That is wrong. It has nothing to do with accepting. It's recognition and presencing, period. Acceptance doesn't figure. I'm sorry. This is a bone I have to pick with all of them. So
that's my same bone. I get blasted for this. And the other idea that they really didn't like was that mindfulness would facilitate this reframing, this reappraisal of negative thoughts in such a way as to see the adverse events in life as potentially having positive sides, potentially being an opportunity for growth or learning or meaning. And they said, well, that's focusing on the positive, and mindfulness isn't about focusing on the positive. Mindfulness is about non-attachment. I just thought that was just a bunch of hooey and totally inconsistent with the original spiritual traditions from which mindfulness came from. There's arcane Buddhist stuff we could talk about this, but from a psychotherapy standpoint, it's just dumb. I've actually had somebody tell me focusing on the positive is just as bad as focusing on the negative. So back to the study. So the mindfulness to meaning theory basically describes a conceptual framework of the mechanisms that lead from mindfulness to reframing or reappraising negative thoughts, and then ultimately to positive emotions, the positive emotions that flow out of that, that can be savored, stimulating an upward spiral of positive psychological processes leading to meaning in life. And so that's why it's mindfulness to meaning. But one of the postulates, which was actually developed not by me, but by one of my colleagues, Norm Farb. I don't know if you've ever talked with Norm, but Norm.
Oh, I love Norm. He's literally been doing this so long.
He is just a kind person, but he's also just a brilliant mind. He's the second author on the paper, the mindfulness to meaning theory paper. And his idea was that the initial moment of mindfulness allows for interoceptive awareness of the condition of the body, which allows one to basically get out of your head about a situation into the body, which will then provide an ability to reset cognition, which then will lead on to the ability to reappraise. What the mindfulness to meaning theory states is that the state of meta-awareness produced by mindfulness disrupts the negative cognitive schemas, the habitual negative ways of thinking about the stressors in your life, allowing cognition to broaden, attention to broaden, but it doesn't just broaden to everything, because the state of mindfulness itself has a positive tone. It feels relaxing, you may feel contentment, you may feel joy, you might feel bliss. What we know from social psychology is that your emotional tone biases your attention. If this meta-aware state of mindfulness broadens attention and there's this positive affective tone, then you're more likely to start to notice the positive aspects of the situation that you were ignoring when you were all stressed out. When we're very stressed out, there's a negativity bias. We start to hyper-focus on the negative, and we start to ignore the non-negative parts of our life situation. So mindfulness undoes that and allows the mind to expand and to begin to notice the other parts of the situation that aren't as bad, or maybe even might be good. And from gathering in all that new information and integrating this broadened array of positive, neutral, and negative events into the scope of awareness, then leads to a reappraisal or a reinterpretation of that situation. You start to see its positive sides. You start to see how facing adversity has made you a stronger person. And I think that harkens to a Lojong practice, which is really finding meaning in the face of adversity. And so that's the theory anyway. And so we went to test it out looking at interoceptive awareness. Unfortunately, we didn't have a physiological measure of interoceptive awareness. It was just a self-report measure. So we asked people, how well are you able to sense the way your body feels? How aware are you of the impact of your emotions on your body? And how able are you to self-regulate in the face of stress by focusing on body sensations? More increased those capacities. So after 8 weeks of training with Moore, patients thought that they could self-regulate better by focusing on their bodies, and they were more self-aware of their emotions and their sensations. And the better they were able to do that, the better they were able to reappraise, the better they were able to actually reframe their negative thoughts and to think more positively about the stressors in their life. And that led to reduced stress, improved mental health.
For me, the interoceptive capacity that everyone has. We have proprioception, we have interoception. The linking up of that conscious 10% that we think is us and directing that attentional capacity directly to the experience that, frankly, the organism is already having. For me, this does two things. In Norm's terms, it's experiential focus. Shifting from narrative focus to experiential focus intentionally essentially shuts off the narrative. And the narrative is always distorted. It never tells the actuality of what
a person's embodied experiences. The embodied experience, even if you're somebody who's in a high level of physical pain, your embodied experience from the point of view of interoceptive awareness is always better than the narrative experience of your physical pain, because that's very limited. And the body is very multiplicitous in the way sensationally pain arises. So for instance, people will have heat in the body and they will label it pain, but it's not actually painful. They just don't like it. They don't like having it, so they label it pain. So this is the conceptuality that gets in the way of the non-conceptual. I wouldn't say non-cognitive, because everything is cognition. Anything you experience is cognition. I would say non-conceptual, meaning it is an experience that is devoid of the conceptual overlay of some kind of self-narrative. It makes sense to me because I see it in my patients every day when I work with them, that negative emotion, quote unquote, lessens because bodily experience is very interesting. It's not a catastrophe. It's like super interesting when you actually are interoceptively directly having it. And then secondly, the body gets so happy when that 10% that we think is us, this conscious awareness, comes and inhabits it, because it means that 10% is not driving it into some story that's then driving the organism into physiological states it doesn't like. It doesn't need to be in. There's no reason for it because there's nothing in the surround that would actually be causing it naturally. I wouldn't say this is mindfulness. I wouldn't say this is heartfulness. I would say this is literally presencing yourself as an organism that creates that joy.
Yes. And there's another piece to this story, which was the point of the paper, which is that the quote non-conceptual experiential mode then facilitates the narrative mode. See, so the description you just gave is a very articulate description of sort of a classical conceptualization of mindfulness. Mindfulness, get out of your head, get in your body. Getting in your body is healing. But it's missing the cognitive piece, which is what we tested in this study. The experiential, non-conceptual, interoceptive awareness of the body facilitated the ability to think differently about your life. It facilitated the ability to tell a different story. And my belief, and it's Nora's belief too, is that we're always in story. Sometimes we take a little break as we practice mindfulness, we get out of story. But then as soon as you get up from the cushion, the story begins again. We swim in stories like fish swim in water, and there's no way out of it. And why would we want to get out of it? Because we constitute ourselves with story. We constitute our lives with story. That is reality, is story. That's one level of reality. There's the absolute reality, which we could talk about that too. But in the relative reality, it's all story. And so as a psychotherapist now, not as a Buddhist monk or even as a scientist, but as a psychotherapist, my job is to help people make better stories. My job is to help them develop more empowering stories, more meaningful stories.
So I have trouble with this. When Norm said narrative focus, my sense of what he was talking about was actually an utterly unreal, distorted view of oneself that has absolutely nothing to do with real-time experience. So I agree with you that the more time a person spends in the world as it is, and I don't just mean in bodily experience, I mean in literally the world, because the world is a refuge, just as much as the body is a refuge. The more time someone spends there, the less time they spend in that utterly distorted, wrong self-narrative. Because that self-narrative, I find, often has antecedents in very early traumatic experience that needs to be mitigated and mediated by using the freeze system, because children can't fight, they can't run. And part of the freeze system is this lovely, let's get out of bodily experience and float around in this mental world where I can be in story and be safe from whatever's happening in my embodied experience. And that becomes a habit. This chronic freeze, leaving, dissociation becomes a habit. And eventually in adults, at least in my experience, it becomes the anxious depressive narrative. To me, that thing is not the same as someone being introduced to who they are, how this world is in real time, and knowing that more, and now having more real-time experience of that, which clearly changes the way they bring meaning and interpretation to what it means to be a human.
That's semantics, but narrative means telling a story about experience, whether the story is totally maladaptive and off the wall or right on target. Although this is a separate sidebar, but I don't believe in anything being, quote, on target. How would you know if you were seeing things as they are?
Seeing things as they are from a Buddhist point of view has many levels of seeing. I will agree with you, whatever that level of knowing that is full on awakening, I probably will never know that in this lifetime.
Or you might, but it's not what I look out my window and I see somebody walking to their car right now. It's not that.
That's disputed, obviously, depending on the school of Buddhism. That, in fact, for many schools of Buddhism, is the nature of existence, is just that a person is walking across the street.
Sure.
If you're seeing somebody walk across the street and you're lost in a story about yourself or about them, rather than just being in the experience of them walking across the street, that's narrative focus instead of experiential focus.
I agree with that.
So this is what I'm talking about.
But again, the findings of this study were that getting embodied facilitated telling healthier, more adaptive stories of empowerment.
They're telling stories, or they're reporting that they have a sense of feeling more empowered.
When I'm upset, I'm able to change the way I think about the situation. The better they were able to get in touch with their bodies, the better they were able to change their thinking patterns.
So this is actually an argument for why CBT is not good enough and what it's missing. Because you can't just top down say, come up with an alternative thought.
Correct. It's also a commentary that mindfulness by itself isn't good enough either. And actually, it's that you need both. That's the implication. And that's why in mindfulness-oriented recovery enhancement, we teach mindfulness and we teach reappraisal. And then we teach savoring, just to add the trifecta there. We teach it all, because by themselves, these techniques in and of themselves are incomplete.
Well, you and I are on the same page about that. Got to have the whole package. The next study I was super interested in was this study you did with soldiers and levels of ANS, or autonomic nervous system activation. And I remember you hinting you were doing something like this. It was fabulous to see the results. Did this study inspire you to dive more deeply into the relationship between autonomic nervous system, chronic hyperactivation, and PTSD symptoms and opioid misuse?
Yeah, I do a little bit of basic science. In my training and as a Mind and Life research fellow, I'll never forget Richie Davidson saying, go forth and study mindfulness. But when you do, make sure you also have a non-mindfulness research area and do both. And it was great advice. So, my main focus has always been doing mindfulness science, but I also dabble a little bit in trying to understand the risk factors and mechanisms that undergird psychopathology and addictive behavior. So I'm mostly interested in the mindfulness piece, and I'm really interested in how more, for example, changes trauma and then downstream effects of that on addictive behavior. But here was an opportunity to get some data on understanding the autonomic consequences of trauma in people with chronic pain who are prescribed opioids. And I've done a few similar such studies in this area. So this was a pretty simple study where we took soldiers who had chronic pain from their service in the line of duty. So a lot of it was combat injury or exposure to traumatic violence, or their body's just getting hurt from carrying super heavy backpacks and whatnot. And so they all had chronic pain. They were all prescribed opioids for pain. and some of them also were misusing opioids. And we brought them into the lab and showed them horrific photographs. So we basically tried to trigger their trauma. We showed them pictures of people being held at knife point, at gunpoint, mutilated bodies, all sorts of horrible things. And then we measured the impact on their autonomic physiology. Lo and behold, they showed increased sympathetic activation indicated by their heart rate variability in response to the negative emotional stimuli. And also we saw some changes in their skin temperature as well, suggesting constriction of blood flow, which is a classic sympathetic phenomenon. And the greater the sympathetic activation to the trauma, the greater the craving they experience for opioids.
Of course.
So it's not like this study's not much rocket science, but it's pretty interesting. We know emotional trauma is highly correlated with both chronic pain as well as addictive behavior. What's interesting about this particular study is that these people are not quote unquote addicts. These are soldiers in the military who have legitimate chronic pain diagnosis and have a legitimate opioid prescription. When we ask them, how much do you want to take opioids? What accounts for part of that answer is how much emotional trauma they've experienced. You didn't mention this other paper, but we also published another paper this year, much larger sample of civilians, where we assessed their emotional distress and their trauma. These were people with chronic pain who were prescribed opioids for pain. It's about 240 people or so. We assessed their emotional distress, their trauma, PTSD, and their pain levels. Then we brought them into the lab and we showed them pictures of opioids on the computer. After we showed them the opioid pictures, we asked them, how much do you want to take opioids right now? Again, not surprisingly, emotional distress and trauma predicts the desire to take opioids in these people with chronic pain much more powerfully than their physical pain level. In fact, the level of physical pain they had absolutely no correlation with their desire to take opioids. And these, again, these were not quote unquote opioid addicts. These were not people with opioid use disorder. These were people with chronic pain who were prescribed opioids for pain. But when we asked them how much they wanted to take opioids, that was predicted more powerfully by their emotional pain, by their emotional distress, than their actual physical pain.
Did you ask them what they were hoping to receive from a dose?
No.
The reason I'm asking is because if you have the ability to measure sympathetic arousal, there should also be equal ability to measure parasympathetic deactivation. And that would be very interesting to study in, for instance, the soldier population and also the emotional trauma population, because those of us who work with post-traumatic stress disorder, honestly, we find it's the inability of the system to naturally deactivate into parasympathetic, that it gets stuck in this chronic hyperactivation. And that desire to use something that will slam the system, like Ativan, which is a CNS relaxant, it will just slam the system for 30 minutes into parasympathetic deactivation. It's easy. The case of emotional trauma, it would be interesting to hear why they want it and what they would get out of it. Would it be, oh, well, I just won't feel so upset, or my pain will go down?
Good question. Yeah, we didn't ask that. My guess is a good chunk of these folks, they would say, oh, I just want my pain to go down. This is the sneaky thing about taking opioids chronically for chronic pain. And this is not my idea. This is Jane Ballantyne's idea. She's an MD from Harvard, world-renowned opioid pain researcher. And she said something once that I never forgot, which is when you're doing a clinical trial, you're testing the efficacy of an opioid for pain relief. And you ask the person, how much relief do you get? And they take it and they say, I got a lot of relief from that. That really helped me. Their brains cannot discriminate whether it's relief of physical pain, relief of emotional pain, or the relief of withdrawal, which occurs every day when your opioids wear off to the next dose. That all three of those processes, physical pain, emotional pain, and withdrawal pain, they're all mediated by the same brain structures, the same subcortical brain structures. And so it's hard for them to tell the difference. That's a pretty provocative idea.
Absolutely. Any other studies about MORE that you want to highlight or preview?
I can't remember if we talked about the EEG and transcendence paper.
We did not talk about that.
Well, that was published in 2021. So this was a study of veterans going through the MORE, veterans with chronic pain who are taking long-term opioids. They were randomized either to MORE or to standard supportive psychotherapy. And then we brought them into the lab and asked them to practice mindfulness while we measured their EEG. And we found after 8 weeks of training with MORE, patients showed increased frontal midline theta EEG oscillations in the brain as they were meditating. The stronger the frontal midline theta, the greater the sense of self-transcendence they reported, greater the sense of oneness with the universe, or the greater the sense of the dissolution of the self, as well as feelings of love or bliss arising during the practice. The stronger those reports of transcendence, the greater the frontal midline theta activation. And the greater the frontal midline theta activation in the brain, that predicted greater reductions in opioid use following treatment. In fact, the effect of MORE on reducing opioid dose was statistically mediated by increased frontal midline theta during mindfulness meditation. So this was a big deal. And this study got published in the top neuroscience journal, Neuropsychopharmacology, because there's been a bunch of studies in the past. These studies have been going on, right? There's nothing new about frontal midline theta and meditation, but what is new is that it correlates with reduced addictive behavior. So this is the first paper that's ever shown that. And it's kind of amazing if you think about it, because what do we know about frontal midline theta? Well, we know that theta oscillations increase in regions of the medial prefrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate cortex when person is exercising cognitive control. So when you're focused on a task and there's a bunch of distractors and you're able to not be disturbed by the distractors, but actually remain focused, that requires these theta oscillations in the neurons of the medial prefrontal cortex. It's a well-known biomarker of cognitive control. Okay, that makes perfect sense. Okay, but then why is that correlated with self-transcendence? And so that's pretty interesting. I have a new paper which actually completely replicates this effect in a different sample. In the paper, I quoted from the Kashmir Shaiva Tantra about 1,000 years ago. And let me quickly read you this quote. So this is from the stanzas of vibration. At the time when the adept pervades all things that exist on the plane of objectivity by his cognitive intent and envelops them with the light of his own consciousness so as to internalize them within it, his erroneous perception of multiplicity ceases. And so he brings all things to rest together in the one reality.
So in the Buddhist tradition, that would be ekajati, which is the Sanskrit for it, or ekagata, which is the Pali. But it's one-pointed awareness, and that one-pointed awareness is the proximate cause of what in both the yogic, Samkhya, Buddhist traditions is called samadhi. You must have this condition in order to have samadhi. And samadhi obviously is that state where the mind is pliable enough to then have appropriate insight, accurate insight about the nature of, as you were saying earlier, the way things actually are.
That's right. I think that's the explanation right there. One-pointedness of mind, which requires increased frontal midline theta, consciousness becomes fully absorbed into samadhi, which is a state which transcends our limited sense of self. So if your listeners are interested, that's published in Neuropsychopharmacology. Amazingly enough, I have a total replication of this in the JAMA study. In that sample of 250 people, we brought them into the lab and had them practice mindfulness, in the same deal. And not only did MORE increase frontal midline theta during meditation, which was correlated with transcendence, but it also predicted decreases in opioid misuse up to 9 months later.
Which of the practices and MORE were they practicing when they were hooked up to the EEG?
It's a mindful breathing meditation.
Mindfulness with breath is the object, which we both know in all of these traditions we've just spoken about. That is the optimal object to achieve concentration, which is ekajati, that one-pointed awareness.
Yes. In our field, replications are rare. So to get get a double replication of the same mechanism, having similar but slightly different clinical effects. One is reducing opioid use, the other is reducing the misuse of opioids, is pretty amazing. This is going to lead us to the last study that you want to talk about. I see these data and it's totally clear that achieving transcendent states of consciousness is a healing force. Therefore, I'm interested in combining more with psychedelics.
Yes, it appears to be the bandwagon these days. I think it's okay for me to be highly skeptical. However, the study that I saw that I was interested in, because it's not psilocybin, which we know has a very specific storm effect where it just blows up the prefrontal cortex and has some effect of rewiring it differently. But ayahuasca is not being studied that much. So this is a study on ayahuasca.
I was just one of a group of investigators. And before I get into that, I do want to say it's clear that the psychedelic thing is the latest fad. My true passion lies in understanding the healing power of the nature of consciousness, which I don't think you need a drug to unleash the healing power of consciousness. Nevertheless, it may be useful for some people to help accelerate their process of learning how to use consciousness as a healing tool. And the jury's still out on that. I think the existing studies are by and large fairly weak. The data is getting totally overblown, but I think that there's a lot of smart people in the field, and newer and better and more rigorous studies are being developed all the time. And I think there's promise there too. So anyway, my colleagues did this study. It was just an observational study of a group of ayahuasca users in South America using it for healing and ritual purposes. They did something a little different. And actually, this ties back to the reappraisal study we talked about, because they were interested not necessarily how the psychedelics elicit spiritual or transcendent experiences, but actually on a more basic level, how do psychedelics actually facilitate the ability to engage in reappraisal, in reframing your thinking about yourself and your life and the traumatic experiences in your life. The observational data from the study shows that they do, that psychedelic use actually facilitates the ability to reappraise adversity as a source of growth and meaning.
Yeah, well, I think the MDMA studies have borne that out to be fairly true.
There are actually some good studies that compare, for example, mindfulness-based relapse prevention plus ketamine versus mindfulness-based relapse prevention. They've got a lot of similar priming, if you will. This paper was published in the American Journal of Psychiatry. That was in cocaine use disorder, and then they did it with alcohol use disorder and also found fairly compelling results. That's actually an area that I'm interested in, as I said, in combining mindfulness with psychedelics to see if we can potentiate the treatment effect for those people who need it. The West is trying to catch up to something that indigenous people have been doing for thousands of years. And they don't just take the drug and then go run off into the woods. They do it under the guidance of a shaman who does a healing ritual with the patient. And you're right, the priming is key. Maybe from a scientific standpoint, the priming needs to be controlled for. But from a therapeutic standpoint, the priming is what it's all about. You have to get the person's mind in the right place and use the powers of suggestion to then help them to maximize therapeutic gains from the experience. And so really it should be this interplay between the therapist and the psychedelic agent and the client and the interaction of the three. That's probably where the magic happens. I agree. If it's just going to be like the next antidepressant, which is what they want it to be.
I know they're actually tearing apart the serotonin molecule.
Right.
And I think they just want to pull out the thing that does egolessness, which of course every meditator would like them to do, because they don't want to meditate for years and years and years either.
Right. Can't we just zap them in the brain? We'll just implant an electrode and just blast them, and that'll do it, right? And then you could have a little button on your smartphone, your egolessness button, just blast it, right? And we're laughing about it, but it's probably going to happen actually.
Yeah, of course, because we have the ability to tear apart all kinds of things. I'm glad you mentioned that this study on ayahuasca was done in a traditional context, because it's possible that a lot of the reappraisal happened because of the traditional context. Ayahuasca is it's a wisdom plant. It has a wisdom. So if you deliver it in the context which actually is in line with the wisdom of what the plant can do, I think you're going to get better results.
Definitely. And you're also asking a shrewd question, which is maybe it has nothing to do with ayahuasca at all. Maybe the reappraisal is simply the context being driven by the healing context. And it might be, so, more well-controlled studies that need to be done. To kind of integrate everything we talked about today.
Yeah.
The notion that shifting from the narrative mode, which is laden with suffering, into the experiential mode, the embodied mode, or even deeper than that, because what is the true body? As the Buddhists say, the body in the body. What is the body in the body? It ain't this hand that I'm waving in front of the screen. What is the true body, the Dharma body, the body of the universe, the transcendent? Accessing that may then facilitate the ability to reappraise the adverse aspects of life as a source of growth or meaning. And that applies to trauma, but it also applies to the adversity of chronic pain. It's the thing that's fueling people's addiction, that they're trying to escape from that pain. And so if we can give them a way to transcend that painful narrative and then to reconstruct a more meaningful, life-affirming, joyous, and grateful narrative, then that's where healing happens.
I agree. Are you still involved with the HEAL initiative?
I'm still a member of the HEAL Multidisciplinary Working Group, and that meets several times a year to help steer the nation's $1 billion+ initiative to use science to halt the opioid crisis.
Let's all just feel an intense amount of joy and gratitude that a researcher and a clinician who just said what you just said is functioning at the highest levels of the nation's efforts to try to alleviate this massive opioid crisis and drug abuse crisis. We blessed to have someone like you, Eric. 20, 40 years ago, it would have been unthinkable.
I feel really blessed, really lucky, and I'm serving my role in the larger pattern. It's my life's work.
Well, thank you so much for your life's work. And I will be excited to see the rest of the things that are coming out, the next 100 papers.
There's going to be some great stuff. You're going to have me back on in a little while.
I love talking to you.
We have a great rapport. I already know what I'm sitting on. At least I know a lot of what I'm sitting on. So it's pretty exciting stuff.
When you feel like you're at the threshold, you're going to come back on again. We're going to talk about the new research.
Awesome.
Well, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to today's show. To get in touch, please visit groundlessground.com. Let's dedicate our efforts to the healing of our planet and all its inhabitants. See you next time on the Groundless Ground.